If you feel guilty every time you set a boundary, I need you to hear this. The guilt isn't telling you that you're doing something wrong. It's telling you that you've been conditioned to believe that taking care of yourself is selfish. And until you understand where that guilt is actually coming from, you'll keep sacrificing your own needs to avoid feeling it. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you why boundary guilt happens and the 3 practices that will help you set boundaries without apologizing for your own needs. I used to think something was wrong with me. Every time I said no, I felt terrible, like I was letting people down, being difficult, not nice enough. So I'd say yes when I meant no. I'd overextend myself. I'd let people cross my limits just to avoid the guilt. And I ended up exhausted, resentful, and completely disconnected from myself because I was protecting everyone else's feelings except my own. Then I learned something that changed everything. Boundary guilt isn't about the boundary. It's about what you were taught about your worth. Most of us were raised to believe that our value comes from how much we give, how helpful we are, how little we inconvenience others. We learned that good people don't have needs, good people don't say no, good people sacrifice themselves to keep everyone else comfortable. And now, as adults, our nervous system punishes us with guilt every time we try to honor our own limits. Here's what we're covering. First, why guilt shows up when you set boundaries and what it's actually trying to tell you. Second, the 3 types of boundary guilt and which one you're dealing with. And third, the 3 practices that will rewire your nervous system so you can set boundaries from self-respect instead of self-betrayal. Let's start with the truth nobody wants to say out loud. Guilt is not a moral compass. It's a conditioning mechanism. And most of the guilt you feel around boundaries was installed in you by people who benefited from you not having any. Here's what's actually happening when you feel guilty for setting a boundary. Your nervous system has learned that saying no equals danger. Not physical danger, but relational danger. Rejection, disapproval, conflict, abandonment. And because humans are wired for connection, your nervous system will do anything to avoid those threats, including making you feel terrible for having limits. Think about how you were raised. What happened when you said no as a child? Were you called selfish, difficult, ungrateful? Were you told that good children don't talk back, don't complain, don't have preferences? Were your boundaries overridden by adults who insisted they knew what was best for you? Most of us learned very early that our boundaries were not welcome, that having needs made us a burden, that saying no meant we were bad. And now, decades later, that conditioning is still running. Every time you try to set a boundary, your nervous system sounds the alarm. It remembers what happened last time you asserted yourself. You were punished, shamed, made to feel like you were the problem. So it hits you with guilt to stop you from making that mistake again. It's trying to protect you from the relational consequences of having limits. But here's what your nervous system doesn't understand. You're not a child anymore. You're not dependent on those people for survival. The consequences of setting boundaries now are nothing compared to the consequences of not setting them, which are resentment, burnout, loss of self, and relationships built on who you pretend to be instead of who you actually are. The guilt you feel is real, but it's not accurate. It's an outdated alarm system trying to keep you safe in a situation that no longer exists. And the path forward isn't to make the guilt go away before you set the boundary. It's to set the boundary even while the guilt is there, because that's how you teach your nervous system that boundaries are safe, that you can say no and survive, that you are worthy of taking up space. Now, not all boundary guilt is the same. There are 3 different types, and understanding which one you're experiencing will help you know how to work with it. Type 1 is conditioned guilt. This is the guilt I just described. It's learned, it's from your past, it shows up automatically the moment you even think about saying no, before you've done anything wrong. This guilt says you're being selfish, you're disappointing people, you're a bad person for having needs. This is the most common type, and it's the one that needs rewiring. If you feel guilty before you even set the boundary, if the guilt is about you being too much or not enough, if it's accompanied by shame, that's conditioned guilt. And the solution isn't to convince yourself you're not selfish. It's to recognize that this guilt is a story from your past, not a truth about your present. Type 2 is empathetic guilt. This is when you feel bad because your boundary genuinely impacts someone else. You cancel plans and you know your friend is disappointed. You say no to extra work and you know your colleague has to pick up the slack. You set a limit with family and you know they're hurt. This guilt is about your awareness of someone else's feelings, and it's actually a sign of emotional maturity, not a problem. The key with empathetic guilt is to feel it without changing your boundary. You can acknowledge, yes, they're disappointed, yes, this is hard for them, and also hold, and I still need this boundary. Both things can be true. You're not responsible for protecting everyone from ever feeling uncomfortable. You're responsible for honoring your own limits while being compassionate about the impact. Type 3 is legitimate guilt. This is when you actually did something harmful. You set a boundary in a cruel way. You made a commitment and broke it without communication. You hurt someone unnecessarily. This guilt is useful information. It's telling you to repair, apologize, do better next time. But notice, the guilt here isn't about having the boundary, it's about how you handled it. Most people confuse these types. They feel conditioned guilt or empathetic guilt and think it means they did something wrong. They think the guilt proves they shouldn't have set the boundary, but that's not how it works. Conditioned guilt is about your past programming. Empathetic guilt is about your care for others. Only legitimate guilt is about your actual behavior. And even then, the solution is to repair the delivery, not abandon the boundary. So which type are you dealing with? If the guilt shows up instantly and tells you you're selfish, it's conditioned. If it shows up because you see someone else's disappointment, it's empathetic. If it shows up because you genuinely crossed a line in how you communicated, it's legitimate. Different types require different approaches. Now here's how you actually set boundaries without drowning in guilt. These aren't scripts or phrases to memorize. These are nervous system practices that change your relationship with boundaries from the inside out. Practice number 1. Name the guilt out loud. This is simple but powerful. When guilt shows up, instead of spiraling into, "I'm a terrible person," just name it. Say out loud or in your mind, "This is conditioned guilt. This is my nervous system trying to protect me from consequences that aren't real anymore. This guilt is from my past, not about my present boundary." Naming it creates separation. You're not the guilt. You're the person observing the guilt. And when you can observe it, you have a choice about whether to let it control your behavior. Most people are so fused with their guilt that they assume it's truth. They feel guilty, so they must be doing something wrong. But when you name it, you break that automatic connection. You can even talk to the guilt with compassion. "I know you're trying to keep me safe. I know you learned that boundaries are dangerous, but I'm okay. I can say no and survive. You can relax." This might sound weird, but it works. You're speaking directly to the part of your nervous system that's stuck in the past, helping it update its information about the present. Do this every single time guilt shows up. Don't try to make it go away. Don't argue with it. Don't let it stop you from setting the boundary. Just name it, observe it, and set the boundary anyway. Over time, your nervous system will learn that boundaries don't lead to disaster, and the guilt will lose its power. Practice number 2. Set boundaries from fullness, not depletion. This is the game changer. Most people wait until they're at their breaking point to set a boundary. They've said yes 1,000 times, they're completely drained, and then they finally snap and set a harsh boundary from a place of anger and resentment. And of course they feel guilty, because the boundary came out sideways. Instead, set boundaries early, before you're exhausted, before you're resentful, when you still have the capacity to be kind in your delivery. A boundary set from fullness sounds like, "Hey, I'd love to help, but I don't have the bandwidth right now." A boundary set from depletion sounds like, "I can't believe you're asking me this again. I'm done." Same boundary, different energy. And the guilt you feel will be different too. When you set a boundary from fullness, you can hold both your truth and your care for the other person. You're not attacking them, you're just being honest about your limits. And there's less guilt because you're not reacting from a wound. You're responding from a grounded place. This means you need to get comfortable with small boundaries, not just the big dramatic ones when you've hit your limit. Micro boundaries throughout your day that keep you resourced. "I need a few minutes before I can talk. I'm going to eat lunch alone today. I can't take on anything extra this week." These tiny boundaries prevent the big blow-ups, and they train your nervous system that boundaries are normal, safe, and okay. Practice number 3. Build a boundary-honoring community. This is the one nobody talks about, but it's essential. If everyone in your life punishes you for having boundaries, you will feel guilty no matter how much inner work you do, because your nervous system is reading the environment. And if the environment is telling you that boundaries equal rejection, your guilt will persist. So you need people around you who respect boundaries, who don't take it personally when you say no, who model having their own boundaries, who celebrate your growth instead of resenting your limits. This might mean creating distance from people who can't handle your boundaries. It might mean seeking out new relationships that are healthier. It might mean finding a therapist, a support group, or an online community where boundaries are normalized. You cannot heal your boundary guilt in isolation. You need relational evidence that boundaries are safe. You need experiences of saying no and being met with respect instead of punishment. You need to see other people setting boundaries without apologizing. You need co-regulation around this, not just self-regulation. And here's what's beautiful. When you start setting boundaries consistently, you naturally attract people who also have boundaries. Because boundaried people aren't threatened by your boundaries. They get it, they respect it, they do the same thing. And over time, you build a life where boundaries are the norm, not the exception. And the guilt fades because your nervous system finally has evidence that you're safe. Here's what I want you to understand. Feeling guilty about boundaries doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It means you were taught that your needs don't matter. And that's not your fault. But it is your responsibility to unlearn it. Because the cost of living without boundaries is your sense of self, your energy, your peace, your authentic relationships. We covered why boundary guilt happens. It's conditioned, not accurate. We broke down the 3 types of guilt: conditioned, empathetic, and legitimate. And we walked through the 3 practices that rewire your nervous system. Name the guilt, set boundaries from fullness, and build a boundary-honoring community. This work takes time. You won't set one boundary and suddenly feel zero guilt. But you will notice over time that the guilt gets quieter, that it shows up later, that it has less power over you, that you can feel it and still honor yourself. And eventually, you'll realize that taking care of yourself doesn't feel selfish anymore. It feels like self-respect. So here's your practice for today. Think of one boundary you need to set but haven't because of guilt. Name the guilt out loud. Say, "This is conditioned guilt from my past." And then set the boundary anyway. Not perfectly, not without fear, just honestly. See what happens. Notice that you survive. Notice that the world doesn't end. And do it again. Let me know in the comments, what boundary are you finally ready to set? What's been holding you back? I want to hear from you. And I want you to know you're not alone in this. You deserve to take up space. You deserve to have limits. You deserve to say no without explaining yourself into the ground. And the guilt you feel doesn't mean you're selfish. It means you're healing from a lifetime of being told that you weren't allowed to have needs. Welcome to your boundaries. Welcome to yourself.